Welcome to the Soul Mirror, the space where stories reflect the essence of who we are. I'm your host, Tria, and tonight's guest, Diane Gansauer, has lived a life shaped by both art and remembrance. A long distance hiker who traversed the Continental Divide Trail and a funeral celebrant who has honored over 400 lives. Her new book, The Waypoints from 400 Farewells to 3000 Miles, gathers the wisdom of nature and humanity into one soulful journey of becoming. So, welcome, Diane. I'm honored to have you on my show.
Thank you, Shreya. It's very good to be here.
And Diane, your story bridges the worlds of wilderness and remembrance.
Yeah.
How did these two paths, hiking and celebrating lives, begin to intertwine for you?
Well, Shreya, what I was finding is that my work as a funeral celebrant, as I'm sure your listeners can imagine, was very intense, very emotionally intense. When you are helping families begin that journey of grief, you must be fully focused on their needs and their loved one's story. And those life stories were the center of all the ceremonies that I did. I can also say I needed to take a break now and then, as we all do. We all need moments to refresh ourselves. And like many, many people, I found my rejuvenating experience happening in nature. So I hadn't hiked since I was in high school, which was a very, very long time ago. And I found myself drawn back into hiking and then drawn into hiking longer distances, which I enjoyed preparing for as well as doing. And to now answer your question is how did these two things come together? It wasn't only because I was looking for a way to refresh myself, body and spirit, to my surprise, and I did not see this coming. As I walked longer distances deep into time and nature, I began reflecting more deeply on the lives I had been honoring. And I started learning more from those lives. I had given myself fully to understand life stories, to embed them in the ceremonies I was doing. But sometimes where I work in the United States, those are a very quick turnaround between the time when I'm called in and when the ceremony is happening. So it was often later that I was really reflecting on those lives. And then I began to also see that the life lessons from those lives, some of them I deemed very worthy of reflecting on because they were inspiring, were overlapping with lessons I was learning from nature and time on the trail. And you might want me to elaborate on what I mean by that. But that is how they physically came together as while I was hiking.
That's very, very powerful and that significant. And was there a specific moment on the trail when you realized those experiences were guiding you toward a shared truth?
It was very early on the trail. I don't know if your listeners all know what this trail is, but in the U.S., it's from the bottom of New Mexico, so our country's border with Mexico, through the states of New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, part of Idaho, Montana, and across the border into Canada. So it's 3,100 miles. I had hiked about 300 miles of that in an overlap in Colorado which is where I live, the state of Colorado, before I decided I want to do the whole thing. So I went to the bottom of New Mexico and I started hiking north. That particular portion is through a desert. So I had hiked 300 miles, mostly in the mountains in Colorado, and then committed myself to the entire Continental Divide Trail, which is over 3,000 miles. And once I made that commitment in the desert of the southern end of New Mexico, it was very early in that hike that I realized I was spending time in my mind and heart reflecting on these life stories. It's very early. So I had almost 3,000 miles to go with that overlap occurring to me.
I think that's so moving how both silence in nature and stories of others can mirror our own sorts of meaning.
Yeah.
And yes, and you have walked 1,000 miles alone in nature.
Yes,
What
a little
is
over 1,000. So I didn't like that whole trail by myself. It wouldn't have been, in my opinion, it wouldn't have been safe for me to do that. But I did walk over 1,000 miles of it by myself.
yes, and what does solitude teach us that community often can't?
I do think we need both. We need solitude for reflection because our life and the world just speeds by so rapidly that solitude allows us to draw aside and reflect on who we are and what we're connected to, and frankly, the sacredness of life that is apparent to many of us when we are in the wildest, most undeveloped places, when we can steal away time to be there. I think it reminds us that we are part of something much bigger than ourselves. Thank goodness for that, honestly. And there's a holiness in that energy that's out in nature. I think we also need community. And there are times when I have felt that. But it's like I need community just to feel like I belong and I'm connected and I'm loved, I'm valued, and that I value the people around me. But time in solitude in nature is of a different kind. It connects on a different meaning, a different level of time than day-to-day time.
Yes, so true. And did the wilderness ever feel like a companion or perhaps even a teacher along that journey?
Yes, and I'll give you a few examples of that. There is a different energy when you're that deep in nature than you feel, say, in the middle of a city. It's just I think anyone would recognize that's immediately something that you go to the wild for. And this hike in the U.S. is particularly known for being very remote. So you are in very wild, remote places for long stretches of time. It's not uncommon for it to be more than 100 miles between small towns, the farther north that you get. So I think the energy there cleanses our spirit. There's a famous conservationist by the name of John Muir from the 1900s, early 1900s, who would say, how did he put it? Steal away, separate yourself, escape now and then, climb a mountain, spend a week in a forest, wash your spirit clean. And I think that deep time in deep nature, it does that because it simplifies your interactions with what's around you. Doing that, for example, you can't carry everything you own on your back. You must pare down. You must simplify what you're taking with you to the essentials of survival with very little, if any, luxury with you. That right away says you really don't need as much as you might think to go through this world. And that is a good lesson to remind ourselves of again and again. We also, that's in a way what the trail teaches you is to travel lightly, don't carry it all. And as a reminder to ourselves emotionally, don't carry everything that you might want to or you feel you need to carry. Maybe you've been frustrated or hurt or sad, but on the while you need to find a place to put that to rest so you can move forward lightly. Nature itself teaches us that we are connected to everything on this planet, everything. everything that's living and even everything that seems to not be living, like a stone. We're connected to the magnificence of nature, and what I would feel and many would feel, spiritually speaking, is a creation. And just as an artist shows her spirit through her work of art, the great spirit, the God that created everything around us, shows up too if we're quiet enough in our spirit to see and hear it. And that's a very important thing to reconnect with on a regular basis.
Yes. And I think that perspective brings such peace, and like seeing nature not as escape, but as conversation with something greater than ourselves. It's really
Yes. And not that it can't be done in the busyness of the day, but we all would say it's harder.
true. Absolutely. And through your work as a funeral celebrant, you have heard hundreds of life stories.
Yes.
What common threads have you found that reveal how people discovered their best selves?
How people discover their best selves. What's fascinating to me is the way people are remembered. And it might be very differently than some of us might initially assume, because the way they're remembered that I saw across these lives is their character. And the possibility of forming our character is something we all can control. We might not control what happens in everything that happens in our life. We can't. Sometimes we just must respond to something we didn't expect. But what's been fascinating and powerful and inspiring to me is the way people are remembered is their character of integrity, their character of vision for what they hoped for and continued to persevere in pursuing for their own good and the good of their family. The generosity of heart. I think what people across all those hundreds of stories that I was honored, privileged to carry an honor for them and their family, what they had in common, which is a pretty hard question there, Shreya, but what they had in common was a depth of character that I believe they worked on. It didn't happen. They were intentional about being good people. And it might not have been in any of the cases, actually, except maybe one or two, I think no more than two, was on a global scale where they would be known for the goodness of their work. It was in their lives. It was known in a very personal scale. And one-on-one moments were how they were remembered. So usually not something magnificent that would show up on social media or the newspapers, They were remembered on one-on-one interactions that powerfully, positively affected the people right around them. Maybe words of wisdom they shared, or just their model, the way they modeled resilience in particular. If I had to pick one word, it might be resilience. In other words, life might have knocked them sideways, and it often does. But they got up again, and they didn't let it negatively change who they are deep down. They hung on to that. They developed, they continued to become a better person based on the experiences that happened to them or that they did shape one way or another. I hope I responded to your question. It was such a profound question.
You have answered this so beautifully, and this is a beautiful answer. And I think every story becomes a mirror for our own growth.
Yeah.
Do you think facing death and reflection helps the living walk more consciously?
Oh my goodness. It's a powerful thing to be aware of our own mortality. I am not in this physical body going to be immortally on this earth. None of us are. I believe our spirit combines with the spirit of the whole universe when we leave. I know that many people have different perspectives on that, but being aware that we are not physically in this body on this earth, and this is how we walk through this world, that is not lasting forever. So being aware that we're not here physically forever, and who knows how long or short our time is, I think is a very healthy, accurate, truthful perspective that should cause us to embrace the time that we have and use it to the best effect, and not use it just to have pleasure ourselves. What I just said could result in a choice to like, whoa, I better have a really good time while I'm here. But come on now. Don't we know that the most satisfying life really is being of service? Truly. My husband and I have one child who is an adult now, and I can honestly say we tried to raise her with that in mind. We want you to be of service. We didn't saddle her with a certain path or how to be of service, or that it had to be on a huge scale, but leave the world around you a better place. And that implies a better place before you're no longer here. So I think it's actually helpful, and the best souls that we all can acknowledge in history. My sense is we're aware that they were not here forever, and they were aware when their time was here to use it well.
Yes. And I think that's so profound, how remembering other lives can become a map for our own more intentionally. And also, let's talk about your book. Your book, The Waypoints, uses the image of stacked stones as wisdom markers.
Can you see that? Does that show up?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So just so they can see what we're talking about.
Yes. So, what is one waypoint that changed how you see life?
I don't know. Gosh. There are 10 in the book. One of the early ones, so the waypoints are basically the chapters in the book. It's hard to pick one, but the one that jumped out first in my experience on the trail, between my trail and wilderness experience and lives I was considering, was the, if you will, mantra, travel lightly, which I referred to a moment ago as I can't carry everything. And sometimes the backpack was very, very heavy. I'm a small-bodied person. It was very heavy because I had to carry water through a desert, which is heavy. But I also learned, sometimes comically, watching myself, or when I was hiking with my oldest brother, he was not a hiker and he had to learn to take stuff out of his pack. He was getting rid of things. It was almost funny, stuff he had been carrying that he did not need. And then to look at some of the lives that I was honoring. And sometimes it was because they chose not to let grief isolate them. People who had, I have to honestly admit, more difficult lives in terms of loss than I have experienced myself. They did not let that weigh them down. They continued to be positive, caring people, or people who just had a marvelous sense of humor and they were funny. And they weren't always so serious that they couldn't acknowledge the funny situations they had found themselves in. There was a man who was a bus driver in the city nearest to me, which is Denver. And he got hungry and drove through a drive-through for fast food, and he stuck the bus in basically in the side of the restaurant. And his friends back at the bus place never let him live it down. I mean, it's funny. So, and he had some challenges in life that his family just hardly mentioned because he was such a lighthearted person. So I would say one of the early waypoints for me was from the lives and from the trail was remember to travel lightly. Remember to pause sometimes and put something aside that has been weighing you down so that you can walk forward with a lighter heart. Yes.
Yes. That's like,
If you'll let me briefly mention one other, because
yes.
it will be obvious to your listeners, this took some courage to do. I committed myself to hiking this trail when I was 61 years old. I finished it when I was 67. So I have to say, from some of the lives that I encountered and from my experience trying to do that, to walk through wilderness in my 60s, took courage. And more than once, I was reminded from lives who were, to me, seemed very courageous. There was a blind woman who learned to get around in life and even determined to ride horses, which she did not need to do. But that was her way of going through life. And her courage so inspired me that when I came to something I truly feared, which was crossing rivers, you can't walk 3,000 miles without having to cross a few rivers. And I don't mean streams or creeks, I mean rivers. I learned from her that you don't become a more courageous person unless you walk through what you fear. That was a waypoint for me toward the end of the trail. So I give you one from the beginning and one from the end.
And I really love that. And really love that. And completing the Continental Divide Trail at 67 is extraordinary. So, what did that achievement teach you about aging, resilience, and possibility?
Well, if one is careful in one's 60s and of good health and trains well, you can do more than you think because the body still likes to move. I was, it wasn't only that I was blessed with having a body that let me do that. I worked at that and I was careful not to be injured. So I learned that we might be more resilient than we think because our spirit is more resilient than we think. And my spirit and the spirit I tried to connect with in nature carried me along. I was asked recently, did you ever think you might give up? And I said, well, there were times I went home earlier than I expected because I needed to recover or the conditions on the trail wouldn't let me go farther. But did I ever think I would give up? And I can honest to goodness say, no, I never thought to give up. So I would say, hang on to what your heart is drawn toward. Don't give it up. You might have to modify things. You might have to adjust. But don't give up until you're removed from this planet. Do not give up. Your story is not done until you are removed. And if you're listening to this podcast, you are not done. So go toward what you feel drawn to, what your heart is really drawn to, and keep creating your story as you go.
That's incredibly inspiring and also proves that the horizon doesn't shrink with age, it only widens with courage that you have shown. And thank you for sharing such heartfelt wisdom and reminding us that every step, story, and season holds meaning for our life. And if after this wonderful conversation, my listeners want to connect with you, then what's the best way?
If you give them my name, if you spell it out for them in some part of the podcast, they can find me on a Substack, which is free, and it's like little newsletters at Diane Gansauer at substack.com. And that might be the best way to connect. In my book, if they get my book, which is available online kind of everywhere, including Amazon and anybody who's a book retailer online, my email is there, as it is also on Substack. If they want to get in touch with me one-on-one, those are a couple ways to do that. I would love, of course, to have more readers, and you can send me an email from there and we'll chat.
Yes, I'll definitely make sure to attach all these details and links below, and to also pronounce your name. And
oh gosh,
Diane, thank you for reminding us that both nature and memory hold quite truths about who we can become. And to all my listeners, may you find your own waypoints, those small moments of grace that guide you back to your best self. Keep walking, keep listening, and let your story unfold beneath your feet. Thank you.